The monitor said he was stable. The chart said there was no chance of recovery. But standing at the foot of his bed, I felt that quiet physical sensation every doctor learns to trust. Something was wrong, and it had nothing to do with the numbers on the screen. I was working the night shift at Silverwood Pines Hospice Center, the kind of place that runs on soft lighting, low voices, and routine. Hospice is supposed to be predictable. People don't get better there. They slow down, they fade, and eventually they stop. That certainty is the reason I chose this work after leaving the hospital. After 20 years in emergency rooms and ICUs, I was done chasing miracles that never showed up. Hospice felt honest. It didn't pretend. That night started like every other: a quiet hallway, a few oxygen concentrators humming, nurses moving slowly, deliberately, because rushing doesn't help anyone here. I had already finished most of my rounds when I stopped outside one room longer than necessary. Nothing dramatic, no alarms, no family crying in the hall, just a patient sleeping under a thin blanket with monitors doing exactly what they were supposed to do. I didn't know why I paused. I just did. Inside the room, everything looked normal. Heart rate steady, oxygen saturation acceptable, no signs of distress, the kind of room you check, document, and move on from. But I didn't move. I stood there longer than protocol required, staring at a body that, according to every medical assessment we had, should never change again. Hospice trains you to recognize endings, not beginnings. When something feels like a beginning, your instincts don't know what to do with it. My name is Dr. Rebecca Caldwell. I'm 46 years old, and I've been a physician long enough to know when my brain and my training disagree. When that happens, I don't argue with either one. I pay attention. Before I go further, if you're watching this and you've ever worked in a hospital, a hospice, or any kind of medical care, I want to hear from you. Comment where you're watching from and what role you work in. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that now. These real doctors and nurses' stories take more out of me than I ever expect, and I don't want you to miss the next one. I didn't come to hospice because I was afraid of hard cases. I came because I was tired of pretending outcomes were negotiable. In the hospital, we talk about fighting infection, fighting organ failure, fighting time. In hospice, we stop fighting and start paying attention to comfort, dignity, and honesty. There is no sales pitch, no false hope, just care. That philosophy worked for me. It still does, most days. Silverwood Pines is a small hospice facility outside Fort Collins, Colorado. We're connected to a larger hospital system, but we operate independently. Our patients come to us when treatment has stopped making sense. Some stay for weeks, some for days, some for hours. You learn not to guess. On that night, I was covering 6 patients. 5 of them were exactly where they were expected to be. 1 of them was not. I hadn't met him long before that shift. He'd been admitted 2 days earlier, transferred directly from the hospital with a diagnosis that didn't leave much room for interpretation. High cervical spinal cord injury, C3 to C4, radiographically complete, functionally complete, no meaningful motor function, no sensation below the injury, multiple exams, multiple imaging reviews, no surgical options, no neurological recovery expected. In other words, a case that fit hospice perfectly. He was young, 19. That always complicates things emotionally, but not medically. The body doesn't care how old you are when the injury is that severe. I had reviewed his scans myself. I had repeated the exam. I had signed off on the admission. Everything lined up. That's why standing in that doorway bothered me. I stepped inside the room and checked the chart again, even though I had already memorized it. Same notes, same conclusions, same words I've written hundreds of times. Permanent, complete. No expectation of recovery. Words that usually settle a case, not unsettle it. The patient was asleep, or at least appeared to be. His breathing was steady, his face relaxed. No signs of pain, no agitation. A nurse had adjusted his positioning not long before. Everything had been done correctly. I told myself to leave. I didn't. Instead, I moved closer to the bed, not because I planned to examine him, but because I needed to understand why my instincts were pushing back. That's the part medical textbooks don't talk about, the quiet resistance you feel when a case refuses to sit where it belongs. I checked the monitors one more time. Nothing had changed. Hospice is where medicine goes when it runs out of options. That's not a criticism, it's a fact. We don't expect reversals. We don't wait for surprises. When something appears out of place, you assume you missed something simple before you assume the impossible. So that's what I did. I started looking for simple answers. Was the lighting throwing me off? No. Was I overtired? Possibly, but not enough to imagine things. Was there a documentation error? Unlikely, but I would check again later. I took a slow breath and reminded myself of something every experienced doctor learns the hard way. Certainty feels comforting until it's wrong. Then it becomes dangerous. I stepped back from the bed, finally ready to move on, when the patient shifted slightly under the blanket. It wasn't dramatic, just a small movement, the kind you see in sleeping patients all the time. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. That night I did. I stood there longer, watching for a repeat, telling myself I was being cautious, not curious. The difference matters. Curiosity leads to bad assumptions. Caution keeps patients alive. The movement didn't happen again. The room returned to stillness. The monitors continued their steady rhythm. Nothing in that space suggested the rules of medicine were about to be challenged. I left the room, wrote a brief note, and continued my rounds, trying to shake the feeling that something had already shifted, even if no one else had noticed yet. Hospice teaches you how to sit with endings. It does not teach you what to do when an ending hesitates. By the time my shift officially settled into its quietest hours, I told myself I had imagined the tension. Every doctor does that sometimes. You feel something, you log it away, and you trust that if it matters, it will come back louder. That night it did. I walked down the hallway and kept my pace steady, even though my shoulders felt tight in a way I hadn't noticed earlier that night. The feeling wasn't fear, it was irritation, the kind that comes when something refuses to fit the category you've already assigned it. I hadn't always worked in hospice. Most doctors don't start there. You end up there after you've seen enough to stop believing that effort alone changes outcomes. I spent the first half of my career in hospitals, mostly emergency rooms and intensive care units, where the goal is simple and exhausting at the same time. Keep people alive long enough to figure out what comes next. Hospitals run on urgency. Alarms overhead, pages, stretchers moving too fast through narrow halls. Every case feels like a problem that can be solved if you act quickly enough. Sometimes that's true. Most of the time it's not. But you keep moving because stopping means admitting limits, and medicine isn't great at doing that. I was good at hospital medicine. Not brilliant, not reckless, just steady. I followed protocols, I listened to nurses. I didn't chase rare diagnoses for the thrill of it. I liked clear answers and predictable paths. That made me useful in high-pressure settings. What it didn't do was protect me from burnout. After years of night shifts, trauma activations, and families asking questions no one wants to answer, something started to change in me. I noticed it when a patient survived something they clearly shouldn't have, and instead of relief, I felt annoyed. Not at them, at the system, at the endless cascade of complications that followed. More machines, more procedures, more suffering stretched thin under the label of success. That's when I started paying attention to hospice. Hospice is misunderstood by people who don't work in medicine. They think it's where hope goes to die. That's not accurate. Hospice is where false hope stops being sold. It's where doctors and nurses stop pretending that the body will cooperate if we just push harder. In hospice, you're not racing a clock. You're watching it slow down. When I made the switch, my colleagues thought I was giving up. A few said it outright. You don't leave the hospital in your 40s unless you can't handle it anymore. That's what they assumed. The truth was less dramatic. I could handle it. I just didn't believe in it the same way. Hospice care felt honest. Patients didn't come to us with promises. They came with acceptance, or at least exhaustion. Families didn't ask when someone would walk again. They asked if their loved one would be comfortable. That difference matters. I told myself hospice would be quieter. It was. But quiet doesn't mean simple. Hospice has its own rules, its own pressure points. You still document everything. You still answer to insurance regulators and hospital systems. The difference is that your decisions are supposed to rest on certainty. Terminal means terminal. Irreversible means irreversible. If you start questioning that foundation, the whole structure becomes unstable. That's why I trusted hospice. It forced clarity. At Silverwood Pines, we didn't pretend to be anything else. We worked with a hospital network, but we weren't an extension of acute care. Our role was defined. Comfort over cure, quality over quantity. When patients came to us, it meant multiple physicians had already agreed there was no path back. That agreement mattered. I had reviewed hundreds of hospice admissions by the time this case arrived. cancer, end-stage heart failure, advanced neurological disease, some injuries too, when recovery was no longer possible. You learn the patterns quickly. You learn which cases will linger and which will collapse faster than expected. Spinal cord injuries rarely surprise me. I'd seen enough of them in the hospital to know how unforgiving they are. High cervical injuries don't negotiate. When the damage is complete, the outcome doesn't drift. It settles. That certainty is brutal, but it's also stabilizing. When this patient was transferred to us, the paperwork was clean. Multiple imaging reports, clear language, no hedging, no experimental options, no surgeon saying maybe. That's the kind of case hospice is built for. I remember thinking briefly that it was unfair someone that young had ended up here. Then I corrected myself. Fairness isn't part of anatomy. The body doesn't care how many years you've lived when something vital is disrupted. I had done the intake personally. I had spoken to the family. I had answered the questions they didn't want to ask out loud. I had signed off on the care plan with the same confidence I always did. That's why the feeling in the hallway bothered me so much. Hospice doesn't leave room for maybes. If you start seeing maybes where there shouldn't be any, you either missed something earlier or something new is happening. The first option is uncomfortable. The second one is worse. I stopped at the nurse's station and glanced at the schedule. Nothing unusual, no pending interventions, no new orders. The staff looked relaxed, which is what you want in hospice. Tension usually means pain isn't controlled or someone is nearing the end. None of that applied here. I told myself again that I was projecting. Doctors do that when they're tired. You see patterns that aren't there because your brain wants stimulation. I had worked long shifts before without inventing problems. Still, the feeling stayed. I went back to my office and pulled up the chart on my screen, even though I had no clinical reason to do so. Same scans, same conclusions, same language, everything aligned with what I knew to be true about injuries like this. Certainty stared back at me in black and white. I closed the chart and leaned back in my chair, annoyed at myself for circling a case that didn't need attention. Hospice isn't about chasing anomalies. It's about consistency. You provide care, you manage symptoms, and you let biology do what it's already decided to do. That belief had carried me through years of difficult cases. That night, it felt thinner than usual. I opened the intake file again and scrolled slowly, not because I expected new information, but because repetition sometimes settles doubt. The patient's name sat at the top of the screen, followed by a list of diagnoses that read like a closed argument rather than a discussion. Jacob Morrison, 19 years old, transferred from the regional hospital 48 hours earlier. The referral summary was unusually thorough. Multiple attending physicians, neurology consult, trauma surgery sign-off, radiology reads from 2 separate MRI sequences, no ambiguity in the language, no qualifiers hiding between the lines. The injury was described as complete by every standard we currently use to define that word. I had learned early in my career that words like complete can be abused. Sometimes they mean we don't know enough yet. Sometimes they mean we're guessing with confidence. This was neither of those situations. The images had been reviewed before the transfer. I reviewed them again myself the first night Jacob arrived. I didn't rely on summaries. I looked at the scans directly through the hospital system we're linked to. The disruption at C3 to C4 was unmistakable. There was no visible continuity across the injury site, no compression that could later resolve, no swelling that could be blamed for temporary loss of function. Just a clear interruption where signal transmission should have been, radiographically complete, functionally complete. Those phrases matter in hospice because they determine whether someone belongs here at all. I remember standing at the foot of Jacob's bed during the intake exam clipboard, in hand doing the same neurological assessment I've done hundreds of times. Voice calm, instructions clear, touch where sensation should register, pressure where pain would normally trigger a response. Nothing, no movement, no reaction, no hesitation that might suggest confusion or fear. His upper extremities were intact. His face followed me. His eyes stayed engaged. Below the injury, there was nothing. Jacob answered questions without drama. He didn't ask if he would walk again. He asked if he would be able to breathe on his own. That told me someone had already been honest with him. His parents stood against the wall while I examined him close enough to touch the bed, but careful not to interfere. His mother watched my hands. His father watched my face. They were already reading conclusions before I said a word. When I finished, I explained exactly what I had found. I didn't soften the language. Hospice doesn't work if you do. The injury was permanent. The loss of function would not return. Comfort care was the focus now. Neither of them argued. That's always the hardest part for new staff to understand. By the time families reach hospice, denial has usually burned itself out. What's left is a quiet kind of grief that listens carefully. Jacob asked me one question after his parents stepped out of the room. "So this doesn't get better," he said. "No," I told him, "not with what we're seeing." He nodded once. No tears, no anger, just a long exhale like someone setting something heavy down. That moment mattered to me later, though I didn't know it then. Hospice admissions require consensus. It's not enough for one doctor to decide. The case has to meet criteria, both medical and regulatory. We reviewed Jacob's file in conference with the care team. Nurses, social work, medical staff. No one raised concerns. No one suggested alternative explanations. The conclusion was unanimous. Jacob belonged in hospice. I signed the admission order without hesitation. For the next 2 days, Jacob behaved exactly as expected. His pain was managed. His respiratory status was stable with supplemental oxygen. He slept in long stretches. When awake, he spoke quietly with his parents or stared at the television without really watching it. I checked on him during rounds, asked routine questions, documented routine findings. Everything followed the trajectory I've seen countless times with high cervical injuries. That predictability is something hospice relies on. It allows you to plan. It allows families to prepare. It allows staff to pace themselves emotionally. Nothing about Jacob's case disrupted that rhythm at first. The nursing notes reflected stability, no complaints of new sensation, no attempts to move, no agitation, no confusion, just the slow adjustment to a body that no longer responds the way it used to. I noticed small details, but I didn't elevate them. A slight variation in blood pressure, a change in sleep pattern. Things that mean very little in isolation and even less in terminal care. Hospice teaches you restraint. Not every change deserves a response. On the third day, I repeated the neurological exam during morning rounds, not because anything had changed, but because routine repetition sometimes reassures families. The results were identical to the intake exam. No movement below the injury, no sensation, no reflexes of consequence. I documented the findings and moved on. Jacob's parents asked appropriate questions. How long would he be comfortable? What signs should they expect as things progressed? What the next few days might look like? I answered them honestly based on experience rather than timelines. There was no sense of urgency in those conversations, no scramble for options. The decisions had already been made upstream and everyone involved understood that. That clarity is rare in medicine. It's one of the reasons hospice exists. By the evening of the third day, the case had settled into the background of my workload. That's not indifference. It's how you survive this job. You can't hold every patient at the same emotional intensity. You prioritize the ones whose needs are changing. Jacob wasn't one of those patients, or so it appeared. When I passed his room that night, I glanced in out of habit. He was awake, staring at the ceiling. His parents had gone home to rest. The room was quiet except for the soft mechanical sounds that fill hospice corridors after dark. I paused just long enough to meet his eyes. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Okay," he said, "just tired." I nodded, satisfied with that answer, and continued down the hall. At that point, everything about Jacob Morrison's admission made sense. I turned back toward his room before I reached the nurse's station, not because he had called out, but because I had felt the need to confirm something simple, that he was still where the injury had left him, still contained by the rules that had governed the case since admission. Jacob's parents arrived early the next morning. I saw them through the glass before they saw me standing close together near the entrance, speaking quietly in the way families do when they are trying not to attract attention to their fear. They had slept. That much was obvious. They were cleaner, more composed, but not rested. Rest and acceptance are not the same thing. I met them in the small consultation room off the main hallway. It wasn't designed for comfort. No hospital room ever is. 2 chairs, a table with disinfectant wipes pushed to one side, fluorescent lighting that never quite flatters anyone. Rooms like that exist for one purpose: to say things that can't be unsaid. They sat as soon as I closed the door. I didn't open with small talk. Hospice conversations don't benefit from warm-up laps. I told them I had re-examined Jacob that morning. I told them the findings were unchanged. I told them the injury remained permanent and complete by every clinical measure we had. I explained what that meant in practical terms, not academic ones. What he would and would not regain. What functions would remain dependent on support. They listened without interrupting. That's another thing people misunderstand about these conversations. Families don't always cry or argue. Sometimes they lean forward and absorb information like it's a checklist they need to survive. His mother asked if pain would increase. I told her we would manage it aggressively. His father asked if Jacob understood the situation. I told him yes. No one asked if I was sure. That question usually comes earlier when hope still has energy. Here it had already been spent. We talked about timing, not in terms of dates, but in terms of signs, changes in breathing, shifts in alertness, what comfort would look like as the body slowed. These are the details hospice families want, not how long, but how. I watched their faces as I spoke. There was grief there, but it had settled into something steadier, the kind of grief that accepts logistics because it has no other choice. When the conversation ended, I stood to leave, and Jacob's mother surprised me by thanking me. Not for anything specific, just for being direct. Directness is underrated in medicine. People mistake it for coldness. In hospice, it's a form of respect. We walked together down the hall toward Jacob's room. I stayed back while they went in first. That's another quiet rule. Families need those first moments without a clinician shaping the space. I didn't hear what they said to him. I didn't need to. I've seen that scene play out enough times to know its rhythm. Reassurance. Apologies that don't belong to anyone. Promises that are really expressions of love, not commitments. I moved on to the rest of my rounds. The day progressed without incident. Nursing notes reflected stability, medications were adjusted slightly for comfort, social work checked in, chaplain services were offered and declined politely. Nothing out of the ordinary. By afternoon, Jacob's parents left again, trusting the staff to do what we had all agreed needed to be done. That trust is heavy. You don't feel it until you realize how easily it can be broken. I checked in on Jacob once more before dinner. He was awake, alert, watching something on television with the sound low. He looked more like a bored teenager than a hospice patient. "How are you doing?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "Same." That answer aligned with everything else we knew. I asked if he had any new discomfort. He said no. I asked if he needed anything adjusted. He said no again. There was nothing more to say. I left the room and wrote a brief note confirming continued stability and unchanged neurological status. I didn't linger over the wording. It didn't require interpretation. Permanent injuries don't evolve quickly. That evening, the unit settled into its usual rhythm. Dinner trays collected, lights dimmed, voices lowered. Hospice nights are quieter than hospital nights, but they aren't empty. They're full of monitoring, just not intervention. I passed Jacob's room again during the evening rounds. He was asleep. The monitors reflected that. His breathing was slow and even. His posture hadn't shifted. I stood there for a few seconds, long enough to confirm that nothing had changed, and then I moved on. There was no reason to suspect otherwise. Later, while reviewing charts at the desk, one of the nurses mentioned that Jacob had been more talkative earlier in the day. Not agitated, not distressed, just awake longer than expected. I nodded and filed that away mentally without comment. Variations in alertness aren't unusual. Pain control, sleep cycles, emotional processing. Any of those could explain it. We are trained not to elevate normal variation into significance. Before midnight, I checked his chart one last time. Labs unchanged, vitals stable, medications administered as ordered. No documentation that suggested deviation from the expected course. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, satisfied that the case remained exactly where it belonged. Hospice requires a certain confidence, not arrogance, but conviction. You need to believe in the assessments that brought someone to your care. If you start doubting every conclusion, you undermine the entire model. That night, I trusted the model. I finished my rounds, spoke briefly with the overnight nurse and reminded the team to call me if anything changed even slightly. It was a standard instruction delivered hundreds of times before, usually without consequence. I returned to my office, turned down the lights, and began the slow work of documenting a day that had followed its intended path. The certainty felt intact. For the moment, I noticed the blood pressure reading first, not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't match the rest of the picture. It wasn't dangerously high or low, it was simply inconsistent drifting in a way that didn't follow the usual pattern for someone with a complete high cervical injury. I told myself it was nothing. Autonomic instability is common in patients like Jacob. The nervous system loses its ability to regulate smoothly. Numbers fluctuate, we adjust, we move on. I had explained this exact thing to families more times than I could count. Still, when I glanced at the monitor again 10 minutes later, the number had shifted back in the opposite direction. Not alarming, just wrong enough to register. I checked the chart to see if any medications had been adjusted. Nothing new, no missed doses, no timing issues. I asked the nurse if Jacob had been repositioned recently. About an hour ago, she said. No issues. I nodded and thanked her, already preparing to dismiss the thought. Hospice teaches you to triage your attention. If you chase every minor irregularity, you'll miss the real problems when they arrive. I went back to my rounds. Jacob was awake when I entered his room. His eyes tracked me immediately. That wasn't new. He had been alert throughout his stay. What caught my attention was the way his shoulders were set tense in a way that suggested effort. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah, he said. Just can't get comfortable. That answer made sense. Immobility creates discomfort, even when pain is controlled. I asked the nurse to help adjust his positioning and stayed long enough to make sure it was done carefully. Hospice patients bruise easily. Small mistakes linger. As we turned him, I saw it. The movement was slight, easy to miss if you weren't looking directly at it. His right foot flexed, just enough to shift the sheet. The nurse froze, so she said carefully, "Did you see that I did?" I also knew exactly how dangerous that moment was. Reflex, I said immediately. Pressure, response. Her eyes stayed on the foot. That didn't look like a reflex. Reflexes can be deceptive, I said, especially with repositioning. I said it calmly, professionally, with the kind of certainty that usually closes a conversation. In medicine, confidence often matters more than accuracy in the moment. It keeps panic from spreading. The nurse nodded, but she didn't look convinced. I finished the exam. Sensation was unchanged. Motor strength below the injury was absent, no voluntary movement, no consistent response to stimulus. Everything that mattered clinically still aligned with the original diagnosis. I documented the repositioning and noted no meaningful neurological change. As I left the room, I felt the familiar tension settle between my shoulder blades. Not fear, not excitement, resistance. The body was doing something small and insignificant, and my training was telling me to ignore it. That training exists for a reason. False hope in hospice is cruel. You don't let families believe in change unless you're prepared to follow it through. You don't let staff chase anomalies that have no outcome. You shut things down early. That's what I thought I was doing. Over the next several hours, the pattern repeated itself in subtle ways. Blood pressure shifts that corrected without intervention, heart rate variability that didn't correspond to pain or anxiety, sleep that came in shorter intervals than expected. Each change taken alone meant nothing. Together, they created a picture that refused to stay still. I checked Jacob again after midnight. He was awake, staring at the wall. Can't sleep, I asked. He shook his head slightly. Feels weird. Weird how... He hesitated. Like my legs are there. I paused. Not outwardly. Inside. They've always been there, I said carefully. I know, he replied. I mean, I can tell where they are. That wasn't the same thing. Proprioception, the sense of body position, is one of the first things lost in injuries like his. It doesn't return without structural recovery, at least not according to everything we understand. Any pain, I asked? No, just pressure. Pressure. Not tingling, not burning, not electric sensation. Pressure implied awareness without discomfort. That detail mattered more than he realized. I performed another focused exam. Light touch, firm pressure, pinprick, temperature. His responses were inconsistent but not random. Sometimes he answered correctly, sometimes he didn't. That made interpretation difficult. I told myself inconsistency meant unreliability, fatigue, suggestibility, the mind filling in gaps when the body can't provide information. That explanation was reasonable. I wrote a note describing subjective sensation without objective change. Careful wording, no conclusions. Hospice documentation requires restraint. You describe what you observe, not what you fear. The nurse watched me type. You still think it's nothing, she said. I think it's not actionable, I replied. That was true. Action requires direction. I had none. By early morning, Jacob was more alert than he had been at any point since admission. Not anxious, not distressed, just awake. His parents arrived shortly after carrying coffee they wouldn't drink and questions they wouldn't ask directly. How was the night, his mother asked. Stable, I said. No major changes. That was accurate. It just wasn't complete. I stood at the foot of the bed while they spoke with him. He didn't mention the pressure sensation. I didn't bring it up. Hospice is not the place to introduce uncertainty without purpose. Later in the hallway, the nurse stopped me again. His left foot moved this time, she said. Barely. But it wasn't during care. I closed my eyes briefly before opening them again. Show me, I said. Back in the room, I asked Jacob to relax. I watched his legs carefully. I applied no stimulus. I waited. Nothing happened. The nurse looked embarrassed. I swear, she said. I believe you saw something, I replied. I just don't believe it means what it looks like. That wasn't entirely honest. I wasn't sure what it meant. I just knew what it shouldn't mean. I finished my assessment and documented again. No definitive neurological improvement, no reproducible voluntary movement, no change in diagnosis. The words came easily. They always do when you're writing what you expect to be true. As the day shift settled in, I handed off the case with the same summary I'd given before. High cervical injury, complete, hospice appropriate, monitor comfort, call with concerns. I didn't mention the pressure sensation. I didn't mention the movements that might or might not have happened. Not because I was hiding information, but because I hadn't decided yet what it was. Medicine rewards decisiveness. Indecision creates chaos. That afternoon, I stood outside Jacob's room, again listening to the steady sounds of the unit, and felt that same resistance in my chest. The case was still supposed to be simple. It no longer felt that way. I sat down at the workstation and logged into the chart without taking off my coat the way you do when you don't want to admit you're settling in. The unit had slipped into its late-night rhythm. Fewer footsteps, fewer voices, the kind of quiet that makes small sounds feel louder than they are. I pulled up Jacob's record again, not because protocol demanded it, but because repetition sometimes forces clarity. The notes from earlier were still there. Stable vitals, no acute distress, subjective reports without objective confirmation. Everything was technically appropriate. That was the problem. Hospice documentation isn't casual. Every word matters. Once something is written, it becomes part of the official narrative, and narratives are hard to undo. We don't speculate. We don't dramatize. We record what is not what might be. I reread my last entry and felt the familiar pressure to either reinforce it or challenge it. Indecision doesn't live well in charts. You choose a direction, and the rest of the care team follows. I chose the direction I had chosen my entire career. I documented that Jacob's neurological exam remained unchanged. No reproducible voluntary movement, no consistent sensory response below the level of injury, no clinical evidence of recovery. Prognosis unchanged. I typed the words carefully, making sure they reflected what I could defend if anyone asked later. They were accurate. They were supported by imaging exams and every standard we use to define permanence. I signed the note and closed the chart. That should have been the end of it. I made my rounds again, moving from room to room, checking on patients whose trajectories were exactly what we expected. Pain controlled, anxiety managed, families resting in chairs that weren't designed for sleep. Hospice nights rarely surprise you. They repeat themselves until morning arrives. When I reached Jacob's room, I didn't go in right away. I stood just outside the door and watched through the glass. He was awake, his eyes open, his gaze fixed somewhere above him. The monitor reflected steady numbers. No alarms, no signs of distress. I told myself not to read meaning into posture. Patients stare at ceilings for all kinds of reasons. I went in. Still awake, I asked. Yeah, he said, hard to sleep. I checked his vitals manually, more for my own reassurance than necessity. Everything aligned with the monitor. I asked him about pain. He shook his head. Anything new, I asked. He hesitated. Not long enough to be dramatic, just long enough to register. No, he said. Same. I accepted that answer even though it felt incomplete. I performed another brief exam. Light touch, pressure. Commands he couldn't follow below the injury. The results matched what I had documented earlier. Consistency matters. Consistency reassures. I told him I'd be nearby and stepped back into the hall. The nurse caught my eye as I closed the door. "You're sure we're not missing something?" she said quietly. "I'm sure we're not acting on noise," I replied. She nodded, but the doubt stayed in her expression. Back at the desk, I reviewed the imaging reports again. The language was as firm now as it had been at admission. No continuity, no compression. No reversible pathology, the kind of injury that doesn't negotiate. I reminded myself that bodies don't recover because we feel uncomfortable. They recover when structure allows it. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement from Jacob's room. Not alarms, just sound, a shift, the rustle of sheets. I looked up from the screen instinctively. The nurse was already moving toward the room. By the time I reached the doorway, Jacob had adjusted himself slightly, using his arms to reposition his upper body. That wasn't new. His upper extremities were intact. "What's going on?" I asked. "I thought I felt something," he said, "in my legs." The nurse looked at me. I took a breath and nodded once. "Let's slow down," I said. "Tell me exactly what you felt." "Pressure," he said again. "Like weight." I repeated the exam. The results were unchanged. No voluntary movement, no reliable sensation, nothing that altered the clinical picture. I explained that sensations can be misinterpreted when the nervous system is injured. Phantom signals, residual pathways firing without meaning. I used language that was factual, not dismissive. He listened. He didn't argue. After we left the room, the nurse spoke again. "That's the 3rd time tonight," she said. "That he's reported it," I said. "That you've explained it away." I didn't respond immediately. "Hospice isn't the place for maybe," I said finally. "Not without evidence." She didn't disagree. She just nodded and returned to her work. I went back to the chart and added a brief addendum. Patient reports intermittent pressure, sensation in lower extremities. Exam unchanged. No objective findings. Continue comfort care. The words felt heavier this time. At 3:17 in the morning, I opened a new note and documented the overnight status. Neurological exam unchanged. No motor response below C4. No consistent sensory response. No improvement expected. I paused before signing. This is the part no one talks about. The moment when a doctor has to decide whether doubt deserves a place in the record. Doubt without evidence becomes confusion. Confusion spreads fast. I signed the note. The act felt final in a way documentation rarely does. I stood up and stretched, feeling the stiffness settle into my lower back. Long nights do that. I told myself the discomfort was physical, not psychological. I checked on Jacob one more time before returning to my office. He was asleep now, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed. Nothing about him suggested urgency. I turned off the overhead light and left the room. In the hallway, the nurse was charting quietly. I told her to call me if anything changed even slightly. The instructions sounded routine, but it wasn't. It carried weight. I went back to my office and closed the door, letting the quiet wrap around me. I told myself that I had done exactly what hospice medicine required. I had honored the evidence. I had protected the patient and the family from false hope. I had maintained the integrity of the care plan. Those were the rules. I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the muted sounds of the unit, and tried to convince myself that certainty still felt solid. It didn't. I was halfway through reviewing another chart when I heard the nurse say my name, not loudly, not urgently, just differently enough that my body reacted before my brain did. I stood up and followed her without asking questions because in hospice tone matters more than words. Jacob's door was open. That alone was unusual at this hour. Doors stay closed at night unless someone wants to be seen. He wasn't lying flat anymore. At first, my mind tried to correct what I was seeing. He must have been propped up earlier. Someone must have adjusted the bed. But the head of the bed was still down. The pillows were untouched. Jacob was sitting up, not all the way, not unsupported, but clearly upright, his shoulders no longer pressed into the mattress. His torso angled forward in a way that required active control. His arms were planted on either side of him, palms flat against the bed, fingers spread as if they were taking some of his weight. The nurse stopped beside me. Neither of us spoke. "Did you do that yourself?" I asked. He looked at me and nodded. "I didn't mean to," he said. "I just tried to shift and it happened." That sentence didn't belong in hospice. I moved closer to the bed, watching his posture carefully. He wasn't slumped. He wasn't sliding. His trunk control wasn't perfect, but it existed. That alone contradicted everything we had documented. "How long have you been like this?" I asked. "A minute," he said. "Maybe 2. The nurse glanced at the monitor, heart rate elevated but not chaotic. Blood pressure higher than baseline but stable. Oxygen saturation unchanged. Nothing about the numbers explained the position of his body. I told him not to move and placed my hand lightly against his upper chest, more to ground myself than to restrain him. I watched his breathing, still steady, still controlled. "Can you feel me touching you?" I asked. "Yes," he said. I moved my hand lower, stopping above the injury level. "Yes," he repeated. I paused, then pressed gently, just below where sensation should end. "Yes," he said again without hesitation. The nurse sucked in a breath. I pulled my hand away and straightened up, forcing myself to slow down. Overreaction creates mistakes. I had to be precise. "Jacob," I said, "I need you to tell me if you feel pressure or pain." "Pressure," he said. "No pain." Pressure again. I asked him to describe it. He didn't use dramatic language. No tingling, no electricity, no burning. He described it the way people describe sitting on a hard chair too long. "That shouldn't be possible," the nurse said quietly. She wasn't wrong. I asked Jacob to try something small. Not to move his legs, just to shift his weight back toward the mattress. He did slowly with effort, but without collapsing. His core engaged, his shoulders adjusted, his balance corrected. This wasn't a reflex. I told the nurse to stay with him and stepped back into the hallway, already pulling out my phone. I didn't call administration. I didn't call the family. I called radiology at the hospital we're affiliated with. "I need repeat imaging," I said, urgent. The radiologist on call hesitated. "He's hospice." "I know," I said. "I'll justify it." I returned to the room while arrangements were made. Jacob was still sitting up, looking more confused than excited. That detail mattered. People don't fake confusion. "Am I in trouble?" he asked. "No," I said. "We just need to understand what's happening." I asked him again if he had moved his legs. "No," he said. "They feel heavy. Like they're there but not listening yet." Not listening yet. I helped him ease back into a supported position, making sure his neck stayed aligned. He didn't resist. He didn't panic. He followed instructions easily. The nurse documented everything as it happened. Times, positions, verbatim statements. That's how you protect truth before it gets complicated. While we waited for transport, I repeated the neurological exam carefully, methodically, without rushing. Light touch, pressure, pinprick, temperature. His responses were still inconsistent, but the floor had shifted. Inconsistency after 0 is different from inconsistency after something. The imaging team arrived faster than I expected. Hospice patients don't usually get that kind of response. I watched as they prepared the gurney, their movements efficient but curious. Word travels fast in medicine. Jacob's parents were called and met us in the hallway just as we were moving him. His mother saw him sitting upright and froze. "What's happening?" she asked. I chose my words carefully. "He had a change," I said. "We're checking it." She didn't ask if it was good or bad. She just nodded and reached for his hand. During the transfer, Jacob maintained his position with minimal support. No collapse, no loss of tone. His body behaved like it belonged to him again, at least partially. The MRI suite was bright and cold, exactly the opposite of hospice. The machine sounded louder than it had any right to be. I stood behind the glass with the radiology tech and watched the images appear slice by slice. Bone, disc, ligament, canal, then the cord. The disruption was still there. Same location. Same clarity, same absence of continuity. I leaned closer to the screen as if proximity might change the outcome. It didn't. The radiologist adjusted contrast and zoomed in, ran a second sequence, then a third. Nothing changed. "This doesn't make sense," he said. No, I agreed. Jacob had sat up. I had watched him do it. The nurse had watched him do it. The body had performed an action the image said was impossible. Both things were true. We moved Jacob back to hospice with orders to monitor closely and avoid unnecessary movement. His parents stayed with him, this time their attention fixed on every breath, every shift of muscle. Back at the nurse's station, I pulled up the images again on my own screen. I needed to see them without commentary. The injury was still complete by every definition we use. No visible pathway, no structural explanation for what I had just witnessed. I opened the chart and stared at the note I had signed hours earlier. No improvement expected. The words felt unstable now. I didn't change them. Not yet. I stood up and walked back toward Jacob's room, already aware that whatever category this case had belonged to was no longer holding. The body had made a decision that the record had not authorized. I didn't sit down when I got back to the unit. Sitting would have meant accepting that what I'd just seen had somewhere to land, and it didn't. The nurse's station felt smaller than it had an hour earlier, like the walls had shifted inward without anyone noticing. Jacob was awake when I returned to his room. His parents were there now, one on each side of the bed, watching him, the way people watch something fragile. They're afraid to touch. The monitors were still calm. That detail mattered more than it should have. If the numbers had been wild, I could have blamed physiology. Stress, adrenaline, anything that fit. They didn't. I stepped to the foot of the bed and looked at Jacob's legs, uncovered, now resting where they always had. Still, ordinary, exactly where they were supposed to be according to the scans. "Tell me what you feel right now," I said. "My legs," he replied. "Like, they're heavy, but real." Real was not a medical term. It didn't belong in an exam. I asked him to be more specific. "Pressure," he said again. "Like when you sit too long." I nodded and moved closer, careful not to telegraph expectation. Expectation can shape answers, especially when everyone in the room wants something to be true or false. I placed my hand against his right thigh and pressed firmly. "Do you feel that?" "Yes." I pressed harder. "Yes." I changed position, moving my hand lower, well below the level where sensation should exist. "Yes," he said again without hesitation. His mother let out a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a sob. His father didn't move at all. He just stared at my hand as if it were the source of the problem. I stepped back and took a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I ran the exam again, not to confirm sensation, but to test consistency. Light touch, sharp, dull, temperature. He answered correctly more often than not. Not perfectly, but far better than chance. That distinction mattered. In medicine, random improvement is noise, patterned improvement is signal. I asked him to try something small. "Don't move your legs," I said. "Just tighten your stomach." He did. His abdominal muscles engaged visibly. That shouldn't have happened either. Trunk control depends on pathways that cross the injury. The nurse beside me shook her head slowly. I stepped out of the room and called neurology. Not a consult request, a direct call. The kind you make when you don't want a chain of messages to dilute urgency. "I need you here," I said when they answered. "Now." While we waited, I ordered continuous monitoring and limited stimulation. No testing beyond what was necessary, no crowding, no speculation. Hospice isn't designed for this kind of attention, and too much of it can destabilize a patient who's already confused. Jacob watched us move around him with cautious curiosity. "You all look scared," he said. No one answered him. Neurology arrived within the hour. Two physicians, both experienced, both clearly irritated at being called to hospice in the middle of the night. That irritation vanished when they saw Jacob sitting more upright than he should have been able to manage. They ran their own exam. They didn't rush. They didn't explain things aloud. They did exactly what I had done, just with fresh eyes and fewer emotional attachments. The results matched mine. "This shouldn't be possible," one of them said quietly. "Radiology agrees," I said. "The injury is still complete." They reviewed the images again on the workstation in the hall. I watched their faces change as the reality settled in. No mislabeling, no compression artifact, no ambiguity. "This violates conduction principles," the neurologist said. "There's no pathway." Jacob's father had followed us into the hallway. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," I said carefully, "that what we're seeing doesn't match what we know should happen." "That's good, right?" his mother asked from the doorway. I didn't answer immediately. "It means we don't understand it yet," I said instead. We returned to the room together. Jacob was shifting his weight slightly now, adjusting himself without prompting. Not smoothly, not confidently, but intentionally. The neurologist watched him for a long moment. "Can you stand?" he asked. The question landed heavily in the room. Jacob looked at me before answering. "I think so," he said. I felt my chest tighten. "No," I said immediately. "Not yet. I wasn't protecting protocol. I was protecting reality. If he stood, the line between anomaly and impossibility would disappear entirely. Too late." Jacob placed his hands on the bed and pushed. Slowly, carefully, his legs engaged before anyone could stop him. His knees didn't buckle, his hips didn't collapse. His posture wobbled, but it corrected. He was standing, not supported, not lifted, standing. The room went silent in a way I'd only experienced once before, during a mass casualty event, when everyone realizes at the same time that the situation is bigger than the plan. "Jacob," I said, moving forward, ready to catch him. "I'm okay," he said, gripping the bed rail. "I've got it." He did. The neurologist swore under his breath. The nurse covered her mouth with both hands. Jacob's mother screamed. This time it was joy, raw and uncontrolled. His father leaned against the wall as if the building had shifted under him. We got Jacob back into bed carefully, not because he needed restraint, but because no one trusted the situation to remain stable. My hands were steady, but my mind wasn't. I was already running through explanations and discarding them just as quickly. This wasn't delayed recovery. This wasn't misdiagnosis. This wasn't swelling resolving. The imaging ruled all of that out. The body had bypassed an injury that should have been final. Radiology was called again, not to repeat the scan, to verify it. Another neurologist joined us, then another. The hospice administrator arrived, drawn by the sudden density of staff. Phones came out, not to record, but to communicate. The kind of quiet coordination that happens when something threatens to exceed its environment. Jacob sat calmly through it all, legs bent at the edge of the bed, feet planted on the floor like they belonged there. "I feel normal," he said. That was the most alarming statement of the night. Normal implies continuity. His body was acting as if the injury was irrelevant, not repaired. The administrator pulled me aside. "What's going on?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, "but it's real." She looked past me into the room where Jacob flexed his fingers and shifted his weight again, testing himself like someone reacquainting themselves with a familiar tool. "This can't stay contained," she said. She wasn't talking about patient safety. She was talking about the institution. I watched as security quietly appeared at the end of the hallway, their presence justified by the word privacy and motivated by something else entirely. I watched as conversations shifted from curiosity to caution, from observation to control. Jacob had done the one thing hospice was never designed to handle. He had changed the outcome. And everyone in the room knew that once medicine loses control of the outcome, something else takes over. The hallway didn't change, but the way people stood in it did. Conversations lowered. Phones stopped ringing. The usual background noise of hospice faded into something tighter, more deliberate. When systems get uncomfortable, they don't panic. They organize. I noticed it first at the nurses' station. Charts were being pulled up that had nothing to do with active care. Administrative logins replaced clinical ones. People who didn't normally appear on night shifts suddenly had reasons to be there. The hospice administrator returned this time with someone I hadn't met before. He wore a suit, not scrubs, and carried himself like someone who didn't expect to be questioned. He didn't introduce himself to Jacob. He didn't need to. "We need to stabilize the situation," he said to me quietly, as if that were a neutral statement. "The patient is stable," I replied. "That's not the problem." He glanced toward Jacob's room, where Jacob sat upright in bed, legs hanging over the side like this was the most natural position in the world. "That's exactly the problem," he said. Radiology called to confirm what we already knew. The second review showed no change, same disruption, same lack of continuity, same injury that should have ended movement permanently. Neurology documented their findings carefully. Their language was precise, almost defensive. They didn't speculate. They described observable function that contradicted imaging. They avoided conclusions. Avoiding conclusions is often the first step toward erasing them. I went back into Jacob's room and closed the door behind me. His parents were still there, sitting close enough to touch him at all times, as if proximity could anchor reality. "What's happening now?" his father asked. "We're evaluating," I said. "That sounds like a delay," his mother said. She wasn't wrong. Jacob watched me carefully. Am I still hospice? He asked. The question caught me off guard. I don't know yet, I said honestly. That answer didn't sit well with anyone. Outside the room, the conversation had shifted again. Legal was now involved, not by name, but by language. Words like exposure, liability, and documentation started appearing where differential diagnoses should have been. I was asked to step into a small conference room off the main corridor. The suit was there. The administrator, a risk management officer I recognized from prior compliance meetings. No one sat down. This needs to be handled carefully, the risk officer said. Handled how I asked. As an anomaly, she replied. Not a precedent. I crossed my arms. It's a patient. And patients come with records, the suit added. Records that have implications. They pulled up Jacob's chart on the screen. I watched as they scrolled through notes I had written myself. The intake assessment, the neurological exams, the line I had signed hours earlier, no improvement expected. That language is a problem now, the administrator said. It was accurate when I wrote it, I replied. No one is saying it wasn't, the suit said smoothly, but accuracy is contextual. That sentence landed harder than any raised voice would have. They explained the concern without explaining it. Hospice reimbursement, regulatory review, malpractice exposure for the hospital system that had transferred him. The risk of a case that couldn't be categorized, triggering audits no one wanted. This looks like a misdiagnosis, the risk officer said. It wasn't, I said. The imaging supports. The outcome contradicts it, she interrupted, which means the interpretation is now questionable. That's not how medicine works, I said. That's how institutions work, the suit replied. They proposed a solution that didn't feel like one. Reframe the case, soften the language, remove definitive terms, describe the injury as transient neurological deficit with spontaneous resolution, rare but documented, no need to cite specifics. That's not what happened, I said. It's what the record will reflect, the administrator said. I looked at the screen again. Already some language had changed. Not removed, adjusted. Complete became suspected. Permanent became unclear. Prognosis statements blurred into conditional phrases. When did this happen? I asked. Just now, she said. We have authority to amend preliminary documentation. Preliminary. That word did a lot of work. I left the room without agreeing to anything and went back to Jacob. He was standing again, holding onto the bed rail, his balance improving by the minute. The nurse hovered nearby, hands ready but unused. Security stood at the end of the hall now, not blocking anything, just present. I performed another exam this time with administrators watching from the doorway. Jacob followed commands. His strength wasn't perfect, but it was real. Sensation was intact. Coordination existed where none should have. I documented what I saw, choosing words carefully. Objective findings. Observable behavior. No theories. Within an hour, the note was flagged. I received a message through the internal system. Please revise language for clarity. I didn't revise it. The next message was less polite. Please consult administration before further documentation. That's when I realized this was no longer about understanding what had happened. It was about limiting how far the truth could travel. Jacob's parents were told that additional testing was needed and that access to his chart would be temporarily restricted. The explanation was vague enough to sound procedural. Why are there security guards? His father asked me. For privacy, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. That's not privacy, he said. He said. That's control. I didn't argue. By morning, the language in the chart had shifted again. Neurology's note remained, but it was buried under administrative commentary. Radiology images were flagged for review, their access limited to select users. I tried to pull up the original scans from my office terminal. Access denied. I moved to another workstation. Same message. When I asked radiology about it, they avoided eye contact. System issue, the text said. Above my level, hospitals don't lose data accidentally when it matters. They decide who gets to see it. I was called back into the conference room just after sunrise. Same people, same standing arrangement. This case is being resolved, the suit said. You're no longer the attending physician. You can't just remove me, I said. We already have, he replied. The administrator slid a document across the table. Not a contract, not a disciplinary notice. A statement acknowledging that the initial assessment may have been incomplete. and that subsequent improvement suggested a non-terminal condition. "All you need to do is sign," she said. "I didn't touch it. You're asking me to rewrite reality," I said. "We're asking you to align with it," the suit replied. "What happens if I don't?" I asked. The room went quiet. Then the risk officer spoke. "Then you become part of the anomaly." I left the room without another word. Outside, the unit was waking up. Day staff arriving, families returning, normal life resuming in a place that had shifted overnight. Jacob was sitting at the edge of his bed when I saw him again, feet flat on the floor, posture steady. He looked up and smiled. "They say I might not need hospice anymore," he said. "That may be true," I replied. He hesitated. "Why do you look worried then?" "Because survival wasn't the part that scared me anymore. The record was already changing sentence by sentence until what had happened would no longer fit the words we used to describe truth." I stood in the doorway and watched Jacob take a step without thinking about it. Not carefully, not like someone testing a fragile miracle, just a step the kind you take when your body assumes it's allowed to move. That assumption was the most unsettling part. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't emotional. He was focused. Adjusting his balance, correcting small missteps the way anyone does after being still too long. His parents watched him with a kind of quiet disbelief that hadn't yet turned into joy. They were waiting for something to snap back into place. It didn't. By mid-morning, Jacob no longer qualified as a hospice patient by any definition we use. Comfort care had been replaced by evaluation. End-of-life planning had been replaced by discharge conversations. The pivot happened fast, not because medicine had answers, but because systems prefer motion to confusion. He was transferred out that afternoon. Not dramatically, no rush, no announcements. Just a quiet change in status, a quiet reassignment of responsibility. Another facility, another team, another record. Before he left, Jacob asked to see me. I met him in the room that no longer felt like hospice. The bed was upright. The oxygen equipment sat unused. The monitors had been disconnected. It looked like any other recovery space. "Am I okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said, because clinically that was true. He studied my face. "You don't sound convinced." "I'm convinced you're moving," I replied. "I'm not convinced I understand why." He nodded slowly, like that answer made sense to him. "Does that matter?" The question landed harder than he intended. "It does," I said, "just not for you." He smiled, thanked me, and stood up again without assistance. No hesitation, no collapse. The body he was leaving hospice with was not the body he had arrived in. His parents shook my hand before they left. His mother hugged me longer than necessary. His father held my gaze and said nothing. Some gratitude doesn't come with words. After they were gone, the room was cleaned and reassigned. The equipment was reset. The chart was closed. Officially, the case had resolved itself. Unofficially, it had been rewritten. When I accessed the final record later that day, the language was smooth and careful. No mention of hospice appropriateness being incorrect. No mention of complete injury. No mention of impossibility. The case now described a transient neurological deficit with unexpected but documented improvement. The imaging reports were summarized, not attached. The original scans were no longer visible to me. I filed a request for access and received a polite denial. Restricted data, external review, not within my current scope. I didn't push it further. I already knew how that story ended. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal at Silverwood Pines. New admissions, familiar trajectories, bodies that behave the way bodies are supposed to behave. I continued my work. I followed protocol. I trusted the system where it made sense to do so. But something had shifted. Every time I stood at the foot of a bed and read a chart that declared certainty, I felt that quiet resistance again. The memory of a body that ignored its own record didn't fade. It settled. Medicine trains you to believe that structure governs function. When structure is destroyed, function ends. That principle holds true in almost every case we see. Almost. Jacob wasn't a miracle. Miracles suggest purpose. He was an exception, and exceptions are far more dangerous. They force questions that don't fit neatly into policy or training, questions institutions don't like because they don't scale. What happens when the body doesn't follow the plan? What happens when recovery occurs without repair? What happens when documentation becomes more important than understanding? I never saw Jacob again. I don't know where he went or what his long-term outcome was. The system made sure of that. Cases like his don't get follow-ups. they get closures, but I think about him often, especially during night shifts, when the unit is quiet and the monitors speak more clearly than people do. I think about the certainty I felt when I signed that note. No improvement expected, words I had written hundreds of times without consequence. That night they mattered. I didn't lose my job. I didn't face discipline. Nothing dramatic happened to me. That's not how these stories usually end. The consequences were quieter. I stopped trusting certainty the way I used to. I still believe in hospice. I still believe in honest medicine. I still believe most outcomes are predictable if you're willing to look at them clearly. But I no longer believe predictability is absolute. That belief used to comfort me. Now it makes me careful. Sometimes late at night, when I walk past a room where a patient lies perfectly still beneath clean sheets and stable numbers, I remember Jacob standing up without permission. I remember the look on the administrator's face when reality didn't cooperate. I remember how quickly the record adapted. The most terrifying part of that case wasn't that a young man walked again. It was that the system decided that understanding it wasn't worth the risk. And once you've seen that happen, you don't unsee it. You just keep working, keep documenting, keep caring for people at the end of their lives while carrying the knowledge that every so often the body makes a decision medicine didn't approve. Those are the nights that stay with you. Those are the cases that change how you stand at the foot of a bed. And those are the moments that remind me even now that survival isn't always the relief we expect it to be. I've spent most of my life inside hospitals working alongside doctors and nurses who believe in patterns, protocols, and outcomes we can explain. Most of the time, that belief keeps patients safe. It keeps systems running. It keeps fear manageable. But cases like this remind me that medicine is not just about what we know. It's also about recognizing when knowledge reaches its edge. The lesson I took from that hospice room wasn't that miracles happen or that science is wrong. It was that certainty can become dangerous when it stops listening. When hospitals care more about preserving narratives than understanding exceptions, the patient isn't the only one at risk. Everyone is. If you work in healthcare, you already know this feeling. The quiet moments that stay with you long after a shift ends. The cases that don't fit cleanly into training or policy, but still shape how you practice. If you're watching, because you're curious about real hospital experiences, real doctors and nurses' stories, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Not to sensationalize medicine, but to talk honestly about what happens behind the doors most people never see. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. These are the stories doctors and nurses carry with them, and sharing them is one way of making sure they're not lost to silence.